Evening, everyone. So this is the last class of this series. Some of y'all are cheering, I know. You don't have to tell me about it later, though. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to be able to teach y'all, and especially appreciate all of the feedback I've gotten, even the critiques and criticisms along the way, and I take it all in stride and with love, and all it's done is motivate me to want to continue to teach both within our building here and outside, and hopefully, above all, that this teaching has been glorifying to God and edifying to you all. So I thank you all for the opportunity and for your appreciation that you've shown me. We're going to continue with context. What I was actually telling James earlier was it kind of stunk that I had to stop where I did with my example with Romans and the larger scriptural context. If you remember, we want to look not just at this one verse in this eisegetic way, eisegesis, right? But we want to look at the scriptures below and above it, or before and after, and even expand that even further, right? To get a full context of what what the verse is trying to tell us. That's just one aspect of it, though. There were two other aspects that I alluded to. One of them is going to be the cultural context, and the other is going to be the situational context. And just as a heads up, we're going to be looking at the book of Romans for part of it. It's not going to strictly be about Romans. I'm going to use some other examples to help us grasp the concept. But ultimately, it's going to come back to Romans. So just be thinking of this as we're going through this. We're going to talk about cultural context and situational context, and then we'll kind of address it with Romans. So to begin, what is culture, right? A culture is something that refers to the customs, the social institutions, the collective knowledge, and the general way of life of a particular nation, people, or a social group. So if we wanted to understand the cultural context of a message, we should first investigate the culture that is the subject of that message, and even the culture of the sender of that message. So when we consider historical cultures, right, in the past, we need to examine their culture not in light of our own present-day understanding, but rather as though we were standing right next to them as this message is being read or delivered. Some things that we might want to know are, where did they live? What was the land physically like? Who was in charge? Did they have certain classes of people? How did they address each other? Did they have any holidays or feasts? Did they have any enemies or allies? What was their economy like? What was their religion like? And what was education like? How were their households structured? These are just some things that we might want to know when we're studying some of these. So in order to get the best possible understanding of historical texts, we should strive to understand what life was like for those who received and read the message in that time. If you don't think this is important, of course, I'd always skip a slide here. If you don't think that was important, I'd like for you to get a copy of your U.S. Constitution, find somebody who is a textualist and somebody who's an originalist, lay it between them, and see how long it takes for a fight to happen. Who knows what a textualist is when it comes to Constitution? Yeah, I know you would, Larry. Do you mind informing us? Originalist and textualist. Oh, okay. Maybe there's some nuance in there. So an originalist is somebody who says, we need to read the U.S. Constitution and interpret it in light of the original intended meaning by the Founding Fathers circa 1776. A textualist is somebody who says, no, we don't need to include historical context. We need to look strictly at the black and white words that are written on this document, and that is what we use to interpret it. Two very different ideologies that will yield vastly different results, and this is why people get in fights about this all the time when this topic comes up. And so this is something that's frankly not even that important. Talking about government that ultimately is not in our control anyway. Ultimately God has control, right? And I don't want to get too bogged down in the legal implications, but I bring it up simply to put that even with more trivial matters, the idea that cultural context matters in how we understand historical texts. So let's look at some references from the Bible. In Revelations 3:14, we'll start there. And so to kind of set the stage, this is the revelation that John wrote to these churches. One of the churches here is the church at Laodicea. So to begin in 14, to the angel of the church in Laodicea, write the following. This is the solemn pronouncement of the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the originator of God's creation. I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish you were either cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I am going to vomit you out of my mouth. Because you say, I am rich and have acquired great wealth and need nothing, but do not realize that you are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. Take my advice and buy gold from me refined by fire, so you can become rich. Buy from me white clothing, so you can be clothed from your shameful nakedness. And your shameful nakedness will not be exposed. And buy eye salve from me to put on your eyes so you can see. What is the cultural background with respect to this passage? And this is going to kind of take us into a historical, kind of geographical point of view. Specifically this phrase, because you're lukewarm, you're neither hot nor cold. Is there something specific to the area of Laodicea that might point us to why this reference will be brought up to them? Mitch? I'm sorry? Okay. Do you know more about that? Okay. Yes. He is addressing it to the church, yes, so the Christians, right? But there is something about the water supply. There is a historical knowledge and a cultural knowledge from that time period about this water supply going into the city. No? Okay. And I don't have my map up there. There's a city called, I believe it's Hierapolis, and this is a picture of it. This is actually a mineral spring in Hierapolis. It's a hot water mineral spring. It's approximately 5 miles away, a little bit to the north. And if you go to the east, there's the city of Colossae. Both of them have churches in them, in fact. Colossae had a cold water supply. Now, this is kind of where the debate starts to come in. But essentially, there is a cultural knowledge that Laodicea is positioned between a hot water supply and a cold water supply. Now, whether that had anything to do with their pronouncement here, I don't think it did. But I think what it is trying to show is this is why I'm bringing this up. It's very well known that you were between this hot water supply. This was known as even medicinal, or having medicinal value to this day, this particular hot spring. Again, well-known knowledge among this region, and that's why this reference comes out. Can we still understand what this passage was talking about without knowing the cultural background on this? I think we can. We may not know all the nuances, but we can still get the gist of what John is trying to tell them here. Hey, you need to straighten up, you need to shape up, you need to do the right things. Otherwise, you're going to be rejected by God. But there is some cultural background to this. Let's look at one that's a little bit more weighty as far as cultural context. Matthew 15, verse 21 through 28. After going out from there, Jesus went to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that area came and cried out, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is horribly demon-possessed." But he did not answer her word. Then his disciples came and begged him, "Send her away because she keeps on crying out after us." So he answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and bowed down before him and said, "Lord, help me." "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs," he said. "Yes, Lord," she replied, "but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, your faith is great. Let what you want be done for you." And her daughter was healed from that hour. Kind of stings the ears when we read this, or hear it, rather. It's sort of like when Jesus refers to his mother as woman while on the cross. It just doesn't sound right to us. So we know that Jesus was perfect and sinless. But these words can bother us if we lack the cultural context in which we were to understand this passage. And this is the trap that can be sprung on us and others when we're reading the Bible and come across something that offends our present-day American perspective. I've heard a so-called Christian claim this was a time when Jesus sinned. And I firmly believe one aspect of why they think that is because they have a misguided understanding of this passage's context. So how should we understand Jesus' words to the Canaanite woman? What's the offensive part of this? Let's start with that. I'm sorry? The race card? How is that? Okay. Because, I missed the last part, because of what? Okay. Doesn't want to help the woman or the daughter because they are not a Jew. What else? What else kind of jumps out? Paul? Calling her a dog. Let's just go to the obvious one. Boy, that doesn't seem very nice, right? I mean, on top of the race card, to add insult to injury, I suppose, calling her a dog, right? How are we supposed to understand this with a proper cultural context?
Obviously, the woman understood that because of her reply back.
That's an interesting point.
So
Yeah.
that cultural understanding of her status in that culture as a ethnic people to the Jews was held in that regard. Yeah, I understand, but even the dogs eat the crumbs. So she understood that in her reply back, and that's why Jesus understood or recognized her faith,
Yeah.
because that's what he took from her.
Right.
And he granted her desire, and that was that her daughter be healed.
Right.
Otherwise, he was there to do one thing first, and that was to appeal to the Jews and try to appeal to them with the Word of God first, as that was his mission to start with.
Right. And it's an interesting point. You can even gauge the woman's response and how she takes this in stride. She doesn't say, well, you know what, never mind. I don't want to be around you, you're racist. I'll go find a better God than this. You obviously are not the one, right? What else do we notice, or how else should we view this? That's a great answer. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, perhaps there's some lack of trust maybe with, like, is this true faith or not? Is this something that is actually supposed to be for you? Vance. Yeah, kind of bringing all the answers here. We know when we read the larger context, right, within Scripture, that Jesus was sent to the Jews first. It was prophesied that salvation would come through the Jews. Had to, right? And he came in order to fulfill all righteousness. So again, we have to understand where this response first is coming from. Hey, I was sent here to minister to the Israelites first. I am a blessing to them first and foremost. That doesn't exclude everybody, but first I am to take care of them. What I think is interesting too, who here was offended by the Israelites being called sheep? If I were to go find somebody on the street right now like, hey, you look like a sheep, would that be taken very well?
If you're a rancher and you're a cattle rancher, maybe it would.
Maybe,
be.
maybe.
Again, culture.
Culture, exactly, the cultural context. Like it would be much more appropriate for somebody in modern American culture, like, boy, he's as strong as an ox, or he's as ferocious as a tiger. So we like that. Call somebody a sheep. Again, we have to understand there's something going on with this cultural context that our current frame of mind, this present day society, doesn't grasp immediately. We need to go back in time to where Jesus was delivering this message and saturate ourselves in that culture. Any other thoughts or comments about this? Yeah.
When the Israelites went into the promised land, they were supposed to destroy all the Jews
Mm-hmm.
who were currently living there when they came in.
Yeah.
They did not.
Right. Yeah. There is, again, this historical legacy with what the Canaanites did. Ultimately, what was done for this woman? She demonstrated her faith, and Christ was honoring her request, the same as any of the other Israelites, any of the other Jews would have done. So, any other thoughts, comments about this? Going to move on to situational here. All right. So with our situational context, we're looking at the circumstances around and within the writing. And this can include the time and location of the recorded event, the types of people involved, the state of mind for the people involved, and what details prompted the writing. And most obviously, if one or more of the people involved stated a purpose for the particular writing. So an easy one is near the end of the Gospel of John. He says to us in verse 30 of chapter 20, "Now Jesus performed many other miraculous signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are recorded so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." What can we infer about the situational context that John gives us this statement? What's the situation here? Yeah, Carol.
Well, John's approach is not a chronological record of
Mhm.
Jesus' life, but rather he's there to prove that Jesus is the Son of God. So that's the focus of his writing.
Right. Yeah, he's there. The focus is to record events, not necessarily in chronological order, but he's there to record events for whom? And for what purpose? So that others would believe, right? Go back to when John wrote this. Was something already written at that time? Depending on, your timeline, there may have been, there may not have been. He said, I recorded this so that you may believe, right? Because before then, it was passed as an oral record. He wanted to write it down so that people could believe. It needed to be done. That was his purpose, right? This was the situation. This needed to be documented. John did that, and he states so right here. So let's look at the letter of Philemon. I'm not going to read the whole thing, even though it is rather short. Try and draw on prior knowledge here. Why would Paul feel the need to write a letter to Philemon?
He's making an argument for Philemon to accept and forgive Onesimus.
Okay, so help us out. Who's Onesimus?
He was a slave to...
So why would Paul need to do that? What situation had taken place?
I think Onesimus ran away.
Yeah, again, you have to draw a little bit on cultural context as well, because we don't live in a time where we understand how that worked. But nonetheless, we can draw from this. He says, I'm appealing to you concerning Onesimus, right? And ultimately, he addresses Philemon as a brother in Christ who had this slave, Onesimus, who had run away or left the master's household somehow. Paul was then appealing to Philemon on Onesimus' behalf to show mercy and brotherly compassion toward him because Onesimus had become a fellow Christian and brother, right? This was the situation. This is what prompted Paul to write this, okay? Any other questions, comments so far? Okay. Okay, so now we're going to focus on the book of Romans. I kind of have it up on the board here, but what's the cultural context of Rome? Specifically, how did Rome relate to Judea and the Jews? Yeah, they were a conquered nation, right? They were powerful. Rome was a powerful state, and how they maintained order was through their military might, enslavement of other nations, and heavy taxes to make sure that they didn't get back on their feet. Okay? Life within the Roman society was just as well ordered. Your position on the social ladder was pretty well established the moment you were born. And if you were a Roman-born male from a wealthy family that had political power, you were going to sit pretty high up on that ladder. So if you were to consider somebody like, if you were to change any one of those characteristics, or even more than one of them, you would go further down this ladder. So if you consider a Jewish woman with no money or a family, they might have well been at the bottom. And if you were an enslaved person from a conquered nation, you might even be lower than that. Right? The Roman culture was no friend of the Jews, and they viewed them as second-class citizens, if not less than. How did the Jews view themselves, though, especially in relation to Romans or Gentiles? Yeah, there's even some allusions to that Paul talks about in other letters, right? In a similar manner, the Jews were the chosen people of God. They had a special connection with him for more than 1,000 years. And salvation would ultimately be brought to the world through the nation of Israel. The Jews had a rich religious background to draw from in their studies and understanding of God and eventually Jesus. And it would be easy for the Jews to become self-righteous and boastful over these things and to look down on anyone who wanted to receive God's salvation that was outside of Israel. So this was the cultural context in which the Roman Christians and the Jewish Christians at the Church of Rome came together to meet and worship. These are the backgrounds that they come from. This is their culture that is now colliding with each other. So now we move kind of from the cultural context to the situational, right? The Roman Christians and the Jewish Christians were divided in how they viewed each other. The Gentiles looked down upon their Jewish brethren because they didn't hold the same views as them with respect to eating certain foods and probably other cultural issues. The Jewish Christians judged the Roman Christians because they did not preserve the same dietary restrictions they received from the law of Moses or keep the same holy days they did. And in turn, they viewed them as perhaps a lower tier of Christian, or maybe even wondered, are they in fact Christian? They viewed them as not as holy as they were, or not as pious as they were. We have Abraham. We have the prophets, and the law came from us. We keep the law, right? This was the situational context in which Paul wrote this letter to them. So why is context important? Paul is making an argument throughout this entire letter of the Romans, or to the Romans, rather. He spends 11 chapters of this letter trying to explain how the Jews and the Gentiles are the same, right? Paul makes the argument that both the Jews and the Gentiles are equally sinful over and over again and in desperate need of God's salvation. Both the Jews and the Gentiles receive the same salvation by the same process, which is faith in Jesus Christ. And because they're equally guilty of sin and also equally provided grace by God through Jesus, they should be united in their love for one another and work to serve God and each other without pride or division. He spends roughly the last 4 chapters of this letter explaining specific details as to why they're divided and how they should be united. How is it, or what rather is the main argument of Paul's letter then? And this is kind of my illustration. If I wanted to go straight to chapter 8, like many of my Calvinist brothers and sisters do, they'll tell you exactly what the main point is. It's predeterminism. It's election. It's calling. To me, that's wrong thinking. Paul is very carefully crafting an argument from the first letter to the last about what is this point here. And this is why context is important. It's easy to get bogged down in these theological components. And they definitely have their value, but when we tear apart this letter, we remove these different contexts we described, and the argument Paul's trying to make disappears. And we're left with a document that we pick and choose how we want to fit our idea of God. As I said, my brothers and sisters that subscribe to Calvinism extensively use the book of Romans to justify the doctrines of their faith on predestination, election, and God's calling. And they can quote chapters 8 and 9 verbatim, but they'll skip 7 of them to get there and then ignore the other 5 afterwards. So in my opinion, they lose the meaning Paul intended and instead craft their own by looking at those passages in isolation. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments, questions about any of these things that we've talked about? Yeah, Clay.
You're talking about the pick and choose. It reminds me when Peter saw the sheep being let down and they had the deer in it, and God said, go ahead and eat it. He goes, well, I can't eat that. It's unclean. And God said, why are you calling unclean what I have cleansed? So Peter was still wanting to pick his way of doing it as opposed to what God was presenting.
Yeah, and Paul even kind of calls Peter out on that same thought process that he was having trouble getting over, how he would act one way with the Jewish Christians, but then the Gentiles, he would shy away from them. And so yeah, it's the same idea of we have to be so careful, even us. We don't know all the answers. We need to constantly be studying, constantly evaluating the text, constantly looking at the context, and trying not to make it fit our own understanding, our own preconceived ideas of what we think this should be. Or this doesn't sound right, so let me make it sound right, make it more pleasing to me. You need to be very careful, and this is why context is important. So many people fall prey to this idea of, if anybody listens to Ray Comfort, I love listening to Ray. He has like the same preaching line. He says, you have formed a God in your own image when he talks to people on the street. He said, I used to think of God as this kind of cuddly, all-loving, all-accepting, forgiving being. That's because I wanted to make him the way I wanted him to make, and not realizing he's just and righteous and holy. And when we stand before him, we're full of sin. That's a terrible place to be, right? This is how a lot of people want their God to be. They shape him in their own image instead of how it should be, right? Is there any other comments, questions, thoughts about this? Carrie?
With respect to Romans, particularly in the first 7 chapters, he has to show whether Jew or Gentile, you are all unrighteous before God. The problem is he has to show it differently with the Gentiles than he does with the Jews. And so he has to come to the same conclusion for both of them, but he has to do it through 2 different routes because, like you say, of their cultural conditioning. What is ultimately important by doing this is definitions of terms are greatly defined by the context in which they're found. For example, if you want to define the word thing, yes, person to define that? They don't know where to start.
Yeah.
But if you put that in a context, now they can define the word thing. Well, that's what context is, why it's so critical to us. If we want to know what God is telling us, we have to be able to define those words, because that's what he uses, words. We have to be able to define those words as he defines them. And so that's where it becomes so critical that we consider the context.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't say it better. Vance.
This lesson on context sort of points out to me, and really reminds me that you can't really understand the New Testament fully and completely without context, historical, cultural. And so for many of those points, you really have to understand the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Study the first half of it, the first part of the Bible. So for all the times in my tendencies, right, to jump to a letter from Paul or the Gospels or whatever it is, and I don't really want to look at the history of the Old Testament that old. Why do we even study the Old Testament? Well, take that example of Jesus himself, and we can't appreciate even the simple difference of Jew and Gentile.
Mhm.
It's historical fundamentals that we really miss a lot of what's written for us in the New Testament.
Yeah, and that kind of brings up an interesting point. I'd read something about how, take the phrase Jesus is Lord, especially in the early church, how would a Jewish Christian understand that phrase versus how would a Gentile understand that phrase? We're talking about the Jewish people who had, extensive history with God and understanding what that means. It's not just Lord, it's Jesus is Yahweh, right? That is a totally different concept from the Gentile who comes from perhaps a monarchy or some sort of ruler, and they're now rejecting this ruler who in that time, especially, a lot of them considered themselves God, and saying, I'm not going to consider you God, whatever ruler name you want, Augustus, Caesar, Julius, whomever. Jesus is Lord, right? Not Caesar, not Nebuchadnezzar. Jesus is Lord. So they kind of arrive maybe at the same idea, but they do it in a different way, right? They do it in a different way. And so it's interesting to maybe ponder over some of those things, like you said, understanding the Old Testament into the New. So any other comments, questions, thoughts?
And would that be something the Gentiles did, was go back and look at Old Testament context to kind of if they really wanted to study it?
I think they would, and I think they would have to have some help because Hebrew is going to have to be translated for them. But I think that's part of the reason these gifts of tongues were provided to them, so that they could understand, or at least have somebody help interpret some of these things. That's my opinion. They're going to have to, maybe not have to, they should want to understand, how does the Old Testament fit with this faith now? Because otherwise it's kind of shallow. You're missing that foundation. Larry?
To me, it's one of the wonderful things that when you look in particularly in the New Testament, and teaching is taught from the Old Testament, the audience either understands it or some way, some background is given for it. It's never, and I think this is something that we need to be careful about, it's never just taken willy-nilly. Any of these occasions where any of the apostles or Jesus is using something from the Old Testament and he throws down something that his audience has no clue what that means. In other words, he expects them to either be able to, or he explains it to them. Paul at Mars Hill is a good example. You don't see the Jewish background there. You see Paul giving a Greek speech to Greeks,
Right.
things that they could understand. So in context, the wonderful thing is, when we do teaching of that, and we do our group texting, which is a New Testament thing, we need to understand that the audience needs to have some clue what that means, or else it's just worthless teaching.
Yeah. Just like you said, if they don't understand it from the beginning, then how are they going to understand this new stuff? So yeah. You have something, Justin?
It's funny that you brought this lesson today, because I was telling Jackie this morning, some of the stuff that we grow up with, if you grow up with a Christian background, like you kind of take for granted the normalcy of some of the phrases that are in the Bible or different things. Like we understand more of the context
Mhm.
because they don't understand the symbolism.
Mhm.
And so I think this is a really good topic,
Yeah.
to try to consider context in those verses. And you grow up, you understand more of it than you give yourself credit for, I think, sometimes.
Yeah. And that's, again, just maybe a testament to teaching our children early and kind of helping them grow in the faith from that way so that they can have the proper background. But yeah, just like you said, it would be so foreign to like, and they sprinkle blood everywhere. And like, can you imagine at Passover time, millions of Jews coming to offer sacrifices, rivers of blood, and they're like celebrating over this. If we were to see that today, I'll be honest, I would be taken aback by that. That would not be something I'd like, boy, this is great. This is the purifying power of God here. But that is how they understood that, right? I thought I saw another hand. Maybe, no? Okay. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? All right. So, again, I want to reiterate, I so fully appreciate all of the feedback and participation that I've gotten from you guys. Context isn't necessarily a literary device, perhaps, but it is a very, very important way to understanding Scripture, and it can help us work through some of these tougher things that we maybe have a hard time grasping or having the background to understand. And obviously, context is probably key. Out of everything that I've presented while I was up here, context is probably number one. But I firmly believe, once again, all these different devices that we've talked about these past several weeks, we can use those in a way that provides a deeper meaning, a deeper understanding of what God is trying to show us. And if nothing else, provides us with such a great sense of awe and appreciation for the beauty of how He has delivered His word, and even the choice of words and the choice of imagery, phrasing that He's shown to us in trying to understand Him and what He wants for us. Final thoughts, questions from anyone? All right. Thank you all so much again.